and clap to indicate the start and projected time, etc.
Hi, can you both hear and see me?
Yes.
Okay, so just give me a second. For POIs, I will take POIs. I'll try to take two. One, immediately after I have completed with my setup. Let me just see my notes, just give me a second. Yeah, I think immediately after I'm probably done with my setup, somewhere in between there, and before I transition to argumentation, I will just try to do my best to take both, one from CO, one from OO. Yeah, okay. Chair, you can still hear and see me.
Yes, loud and clear. And actually, if you
All
guys
right.
want, and it will be useful, I can also turn camera on from my side. Sometimes it's nice to talk to a face rather than into the void.
I don't know, most people don't really appreciate it. I appreciate it. I think it just makes it much easier for me. All right. Okay. So I'm gonna start the speech. I'm gonna start the speech in three, two, one, go. Give a man a fish and feed him for a day. Teach a man how to fish and teach a man how to fish and feed him for a lifetime. A couple of things on setup. What does public programs actively look like? It looks like you're developing infrastructure and all this. Mainly, I want to highlight that this often happens in rural areas. Why is this important? Because a lot of the large scale infrastructure within the developed cities has already happened. So actively, maybe it's about improving or it's about maintenance. But most of the times, this large infrastructure is something that connects cities. So, for example, when you're trying to connect provinces, when you're trying to connect specific places, so usually happens in rural areas. But the second thing I also want to highlight here is, what do cash transactions look like? Cash transactions look like you to be giving this for direct amounts of money. But it has two things. One, it is usually conditional and sometimes unconditional. I want to posit here in setup that most of the time, the point at which opposition implements this, they are much more likely going to be unconditional. A couple of reasons why. Most of the times, a lot of the type of people we're looking at are unable to meet those conditions. One, school attendancy. What I would like to posit that if this school attendancy is for young children, child labor. So that's our strategy. But most likely, it looks like people who are much more likely going to, let's say, tertiary institutions, or people who are much more likely going, yeah, tertiary institutions in general. I want to explain that this is probably unlikely going to happen because a lot of these people don't have the desire. Why? A lot of them have family members who they probably have to take to, but most importantly, they just don't meet the conditions because some of these conditions are quite just generally very difficult for them to attain. But most importantly, they don't understand the value. Why? A large part of their life has been on living day to day. A large part of their life has been conditioning them. So that conditioning makes it that they're oftentimes unable to meet those conditions. So you have to give them the money unconditionally. And I'll give you a bit more analysis when I proceed. But I want to ask, are there any clarifications in terms of context? Three, two, one, go. The first argument or the first piece of analysis I want to explain here is broadly, why do we think that cash transactions are just never going to work? One, because they tend to be given unconditionally, these people aren't going to meet them. What's the problem with this? One, you essentially create backlash onto the state. Why? Because for normal taxpayers who are in the middle income status, it looks like you're simply giving away free money. I want to recognize how this backlash specifically happens. It happens in two folds. One, it tends to happen in social disobedience where people don't fulfill their civic obligations. Civic obligations, like where you're mandated to report all your taxes. So you have people engaging in more tax evasion. But most importantly, you have a lot of people blocking already existing infrastructure, already existing policies. So, for example, when people don't take part in elections. And not panic, you have to care about social or civic importance because not these are the things which drive society. When people cast their votes, when people take part in community discussions as to the types of problems that they have. No, when people don't do that, it becomes very difficult for you to implement government policy. The second thing is here, I want to say, even when they get this money, regardless of whether you think it's unconditional or conditional, the type of choices they make tend to be irrational. Two reasons here. One, the type of information they tend to be circulated next to is very short termist. What do I mean here? A lot of people or a lot of media companies or a lot of MNCs consistently putting out short-term information as to how you're going to be able to make money in the short term, like investing or taking risk. Not that when these people get a lot of money, because they want to talk to the top class, they're much more likely going to invest their money, if they actually do invest, in very, very bad things. This is to say, in things like pyramid schemes for them to actually make money. Not that they're more susceptible to fraud because they don't have the specific guidance. People say to give them guidance. I want to be very clear here. Even if you give them guidance, these are people who actively want money, and when they are scammed, those scams are very specific to them. Second thing I'll explain here is that most of the times they tend to be irrational. Why? They tend to idolize the luxurious things that they tend to look at. This is important because even when they get the money, they spend it poorly on luxuries. Fourth thing here, you're much more likely going to get inflationary tendencies on side opposition. Why? When people spend their goods much more likely on luxurious things, this does not create the specific ground for investment. Why? Because it is short term, that money gets done. Comparatively, when we give people money, they're much more likely going to do on basic needs. And I want to now explain why public works ultimately the best in this debate. A couple of things here, 3 layers of analysis. First, that you actually grow them skills. This is important because part of the skill set they tend to have is skill set of building things. Why? Because they have to build the houses they're in. They have to provide for their families. So note, the type of skill set they are growing, things which they already are good at, or which things that they're already potentially trying, because this is where they were able to make money on day to day. Want to claim that you're much more like, oh, there's an urgency. I want to note that you can simply be flexible and pay these guys every day. For example, a porter who works at any site anywhere in the world, let's say in Africa, or any Latino, or anywhere, or immigrants, paid daily because they need that money daily. I want to be clear here. When you pay money daily, you meet the immediate burden and responsibility for fighting for your family. This is crucial because you're much more likely going to spend that money on the basic needs. What's the impact for that specific analysis? The impact is that you are much more likely going to attract long-term investment because spending is much more long-term. It is every day on your basic needs. This is much more likely going to attract investment in comparison to the more short-termist type of planning that ultimately happens inside opposition. The second thing here I want to say is it ultimately just reduces government spending. Why? I want to be clear here that when these people are working for this project, they're basically cheap labor. Why? They are low skilled. This is important because comparatively, the amount at which state spends to do for them things is much more less. This is important because ultimately it just makes it easier for things to provide for them. But most importantly, it is spending which is so input of roads being built, input of things being much better for them. Not that infrastructure is so beneficial because the people end up benefiting from twofold. One, they benefit from the fact that they are making incomes and they're able to benefit themselves. Two, they also benefit from the infrastructure because with infrastructure come other benefits. This is why my speech at the context where I tell you that it happens mostly in rural areas when you're trying to join cities is crucial because ultimately they actually benefit because there's input within the economy. I want to summarize this by saying the impacts are crucial. One, you are much more likely going to get better investments, but less likely, you're less likely going to get inflationary tendencies on our side. Why? Because the spending is spaced out on more basic needs and everyday needs, that capital ultimately accumulates. This is crucial because investment can happen on both sides. Long-term investment is better on our side. So on their side, you don't incentivize investment. The last thing I want to say in my 15 seconds here is simple. What do I prove? I prove that the cash transactions are never going to work. But secondly, I prove why the public works are much better. I tried offer a P1, they didn't take. Proud. Pick OG.
Thanks for that speech. And can we have the leader of the opposition? Yeah.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, so give me a second to set up my timer. I'll take a POI, mostly from CG though. Yeah. Don't unmute if I don't ask you to. I'm gonna ask for a POI in my speech, so just relax. Okay. Panel, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. This debate is basically about should poor people have the autonomy to choose. Opening opposition says yes. Even when you are poor and homeless, you still have the very thing that makes people live, which is human dignity. I'm going to be basing a lot of my debates on principles, and my partner is going to focus more on the pragmatics. But let's then go into this debate, right? I think, right, it's very classist for opening government to say, oh, they give 3 minutes about how poor people are going to misuse this money. This is ludicrous because it's based on an assumption that poor people do not have sense. Like, just because like I am not the richest, or I know so many people that were like terribly poor, but obviously still have the sense to be able to use their money to do like productive things and all. But I'm going to engage this debate that even if they do not like use the money well, why we think that as a society they still need to be able to make this choice on how to use their money, right? The first thing I'm going to talk about then is choice, because I think opening government blurs the lines between welfare and forced labor, right? Because what happens in opening government and closing government world is that they do not become these workers because they want to, or because it's their life dream, or because it is valuable or dignified. But they only become these workers because they are desperate, right? So they do the choice then becomes either do low skilled work or starve. What this creates is that when people are desperate and do not have choices, it means that you create things like exploitative wages, because at the end of the day, they don't have a fucking choice anyways. So they are going to do the work even if you're paying them ridiculous amounts of fees. Secondly, it removes any bargaining power they may have. The reason why, for example, like I'm a lawyer and we have like unions, even like other professions have unions and stuff like that, because we have some level of bargaining power at least against the government. But this is different from very low skilled workers who like do not have like any bargaining power, because again they have literally been forced to do this like particular low skilled work even for terrible wages and stuff like that. Meaning that at the end of the day, you get things like exploitative like labor laws and stuff like that, because they do not have people to like defend them and stuff like that. Thirdly, it leads to things like dangerous working conditions again, because they are going to do this work despite despite if they want to do it or not. So at the end of the day, they do not have a choice, meaning that it gives room to be able to exploit these individuals with less choices. We think our world gives beneficiaries the dignity to choose. So individuals on our world are able to, if they want to learn a skill, sure. If they also want to go into education, sure. We think that it is particularly important. But the reason why their world is even terrible is that even if you ignore everything I've said, this is not sustainable, right? Because we live in a world that is going like is very, very technological, like AI, stuff like that. Meaning that again, low skilled work are becoming like out of like are becoming should I say like out of like use. Do you get? So most times all this like low skilled work, because the motion particularly says low skilled work. So low skilled work are mainly being replaced by heavy duty machineries and stuff like that. We posit that these skills are particularly useless to them, because in a few years they are going to anyways be replaced by machineries and AI, because this is inherently cheaper in the long run for the government. So they are more likely going to do this. So we think that again, so it's not about teaching a man to continually survive. We don't think that works even on their work, on their world. The second thing I'm going to talk about is accountability. We think that public works require massive level of administrative oversight. So basically, it means that your daily bread is linked to the ability of those projects to be efficient. The reason why this is problematic is that projects can be abandoned, right? Because they rightfully like frame this in a developing world or like remote areas and stuff like that. Come to any remote areas. In fact, come to my streets, basically. Projects are abandoned every year. Like the East West Road in Port Harcourt has used like 50 years to complete that project, and it's still not completed because it has been abandoned. But it also means that governments moves different cycles. So a government can be like voted out and voted in like in a new cycle every 2 years, every 4 years, all these things. They also government has to spend large money on materials, contractors, etc. We think outside of the world, it's more efficient because we have low administrative costs. It reduces leakages and like corruption, all those things, but also allows money to be able to go to most urgent needs like food, rent, healthcare, etc. Meaning that on our side of the world, these people are poor and dying now. They do not have 1 year to wait for the implementation of a project that may be abandoned. We think that human dignity and needs need to be taken care of now, not like in the future. We think it also leads governments to evade accountability. So instead of like you continually leave people poor while saying, oh, we are giving you welfare through like these projects. So that's what you should take anyways. Before I go on, what's your POI?
All this you're saying is symmetric. This debate assumes that states will do all this. Even on your side, the state could switch and not want to give this money. You can't win the debate like this. You're screwing it.
Okay, like we did not say that the state is not going to do all things. I'm just saying that people's survival should not be benched on how efficient a project is when most likely it's not completely efficient. Like, well, anyways, third thing I'm going to talk about is how it harms women and marginalized groups. We think that public works harms women because women's time are taken through like unpaid work already. So our time is limited, but also it ignores things like women have to do things like childcare, pregnancy, disability, all those things. On the other side of the world, it deepens inequality, gender equality, and class inequality, right? Because on the side of the world, it shifts power in household, meaning that at least everybody is equal and everybody is able to get like significant amounts of money. The last thing then is that autonomy should not be conditional on perfection. Wealthy people like get things like tax breaks, inheritance, subsidies without having to work. The principle is simple. Why should poor people be able to only work for survival when no other groups does that, right? They get benefits. We think poor people should survival should not be conditional on having to break your backs, especially when you are limiting the most vulnerable in society. Clearly wins on principle, pragmatics. Thank you.
Thanks for that speech. To recall upon the DPM.
Hey, am I audible?
Loud and clear.
Okay, just to be clear, I'm Zephyr. I'm going to be the DPM. I'll ask for a POI at around my fifth minute. If you asked before, I'm likely to ignore you, Bambi, because I lot to say. So yeah, I'm going to be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. There are 3 bad arguments that you get from OO. 1, the argument of autonomy to choose. Pano, I think nobody in status quo has autonomy in regards to how they end up getting money. By capitalism, we'll all have to work. If she wants to advocate for communist sort of mindset, she has to understand that 1, and most importantly, it's a non-sustaining model, which means somebody's consistently going to have to fund it. It becomes pristine and justified to consistently take for a system and not give to it. I think 2, she talks about worker protections and dignity. 3 charts here. 1, government has to be a good actor on either side. If government is a bad actor, then poverty will definitely exist on both sides. That means on her side of the house, pay will be held because governments have shown themselves to be vastly entitled and therefore can give you as little money as possible or based on what they think is enough for you. But 2, government policy will still change. And once again, the systems may not be consistently offering you money every month or every week and whatnot. This means that situations whereby your pay is withheld because of the fact that government says that because of bureaucratic reasons or because of cuts here and there, we can't just give you money. And you don't have any work that you've done to then be justified to get it. You have no grounds in court, as in you put in work and then must receive work. I think a bad actor heavily works worse on her side because it's based entirely on government being good rather than an exchange between citizens and government in that of itself a social contract of sorts. I think too, access to financial independence and giving people a way to earn money without being hyper dependent on other groups of people in and of itself is one of the strongest forms of dignity. I think as an actor who's struggling to get a job in the event that the job market has halted, you can still access jobs, and more analysis on this later. It's far better to give people financial independence because that in and of itself reverts a high extent of dignity, etc. Lastly, she talks about women and marginalized groups. I think not all work in construction, etc. is physical labor. You can be involved in planning, you can be involved in catering, you can be involved in secretary work. This entire system can be run by women and gender minorities without really bad analysis on feminism. 3 clashes are going to be important in this debate. 1, urgency; 2, solvency; 3, sustainability. First on urgency, 2 arguments here. 1, people incapable of work are not included in this debate. That means if you urgently need income because you're perhaps a disabled person, like, I don't know, your legs don't work or you're blind, etc., you're not included in this debate. You will get your vulnerability stimulus check, etc. That's not important. But I think too, in the event that you're really struggling for income, things such as daily payments are common in fields such as construction, etc., because they know that they deal with vulnerable populations. This is taken out of the debate. 2, solvency. I think there are just 2 charts here to have on solvency before the comparative. 1, the entry point that you acquire into the job market. That is to say, these are temporary jobs. Everyone we are offering a sort of stimulus check, we want them to work and then leave. What are 3 things you get from our side? 1, you get a high extent of education. That is to say, you're well aware about this field because you're actively working in it and getting practical experience. 2, you have a level of work experience to fill that spot in your CV. And more analysis later on why consistent filling up of your CV is drastically important in getting back into the job market. 3, you're put in a network. That means even if you're an accountant, you always have this background of construction, etc., to tend to lean back on in regards to earning a sense of income. If worst case scenario, you don't get a job in accounting. In opposition's world, especially when she talks about some jobs going obsolete, etc., nobody then, if your job becomes obsolete, you have no chance of getting back. You don't really have a direct field or a direct point of entry to another source of income. On our side of the house, however, there's an extent to which you've built a sort of safety net in this other profession that you work with. But I think too, white collar jobs inherently are unaffected, and this is for 3 reasons. 1, because of the fact that it's viewed as temporary and a transitional job. It's very easy to get time off to do things such as interviews. It's very easy to do things such as career guidance, etc., to ensure you work for that job. 2, it doesn't take that much time to apply for a job because most of these systems are automated. I can apply for jobs for 2 hours a day, head to work, come back, live with my family, etc. It's not that large of a deal. I think you can still be very active in the job market, search and whatnot, even when you have this job. And I think 3, you still have resources to ensure one ends up in a job inevitably. That is, the government wants to get you out as fast as possible because it's likely they're giving you more money than the work you're putting in because they want to shoulder for you. So they're most likely to want to get you out of here as fast as possible, therefore pushing sort of career guidance, working towards work stimulus to ensure you're pushed out of the system. You can't even get a job in the government because you've now had this sort of connection to it. I think on the upside, however, people are most likely going to remain in a state of inertia and failure to get a job. And this happens from 2 specific angles. The first angle is your employer being unlikely to employ you, and the second is you being unlikely to apply for jobs. 3 reasons how this is going to happen. The first is you're unlikely to be hired because you're viewed as lazy or to some extent incompetent. It's why people who had large gaps in their CVs during COVID were not hired because they were undergraduates, or there were people who had more consistent gaps in their work. People who even have things such as volunteering on their CVs, etc., have a higher chance of getting a job compared to somebody who was 100% completely incompetent. I think 2, you have a large gap in your resume, which obviously shows you've not been actively participating in the economy. And I think 3, the person themselves can adopt a sense of dependence on their relatives, friends, workers, etc. That is to say, people can get comfortable. Not everyone really wants to work, as Peace literally argues in her speech. Not everyone wants to put in that much effort. So it's likely that you can fall into a state of inertia and a general refusal to work in the vast majority of instances. I'll take a POI if there's any.
Okay, so our world, people can still get jobs. The question is to choose what jobs or education. Your burdens is why should they be forced to take that particular method?
Please, I don't think you know how to frame. If people can get jobs, then get the job. Neither side can help you. You're not offering people stimulus checks. We're not offering them any. In our side of the house, if you want a job, you can still get a job. Do your work in construction, do your planning, do your etc. In the evenings or whenever you can, go apply for the jobs that you wish for. The idea is simple. And this is the last part on how our model is more sustainable. Let me just jump into that. I think there are 2 charts that we're going to have here. 1, the fact is that the first thing in sustainability, she argues, is jobs are unlikely to last for a while, such as, farming, etc., or building, electricians because of AI. I think all jobs are going to systematically be needed, such as builders, electricians, just because it's more cost effective. It's always cheaper rather than getting a machine. AI has tried to build something. I don't think any job can be replaced. And by that analysis, all jobs can be replaced therefore. And therefore, why do we study? Why do we work? Why do we go to college? Why do we even debate if we can be replaced with ChatGPT, with people using speeches? I think you can involve yourself in jobs to earn a sense of income, even if those situations are likely. But I think too, and this is the most important class, which is backlash from taxpayers. That is to say, in status quo, there's a general atmosphere of a recession. People are in debt, people have car payments, etc. Citizens tend to be aversive to systems that do not sustain themselves. That is, you heavily rely on others to give you a sense of financial actualization at the end of the day. The belief people will have is that these workers are going to have a large extent of inertia to enter the market, especially when it gets highly competitive. It's easy to to just rely on the government and collect your check every now and then. We've seen people commit tax fraud or commit sort of fraud to consistently get checks from the government rather than working. These people do exist in status quo. The harm caused by those people is far worse because they're principally binging off of people in the world. But B, their acts can actually trickle down into other systems and whatnot and make other people follow in their footsteps, etc. This means that even if the model is affected, two problems. One, it can experience reduced funding under times of recession, but there's opportunist leaders who want to buy into a public of people who are bitter about the fact that they have to work while others are gaining, access. But two, even if the model is instigated, it can be easily shut down because of the general idea of the fact that people are unhappy with it, etc. I think like how Trump does it. The flip on our side, however, is because people have done work, they are going to be paid. With that, I rest.
Thanks for that speech. Can we have the DL?
Apologies. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I have a bit of network issues. So for anyone that wants to ask a POI, you can just put it through text, so that it really doesn't disrupt, and I can just mentally prepare myself for that. Please just drop timestamps for me because I won't be able to look at it. Look at my timer. All right. With that being said, I'm going to start my speech.
Sure. And one question. Would it be better if I turn off my camera from a networking issue perspective, or is that okay?
If people can turn off their camera just for my speech, I would deeply appreciate.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So once my speech is just over, you can just turn it on. I deeply appreciate that. All right. With that being said, I'm going to start my. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. There are 3 things from OG. One is that people are irrational. My partner already explains why not everyone is poor because they are irrational. Some people just lack the accessibility to high capital, which means poverty exists in your world when you just give them this menial job. But what you do is the creation of things like more gentrification and problems that we keep on seeing in society when people are boxed into places with menial jobs and all sort of things, and you keep on having the subjugation of individuals. That's just the repetition of the toxic cycle that poor people like live in. You don't solve any problem. The problem gets solved on our side because we empower people to be able to make these particular decisions and to be able to further their life. The second thing that they see is that, infrastructure benefits everyone in the economy. This is funny because when most factories ended up being built, it often benefits more of the rich individuals because these are the people that have access to power to be able to put their children and themselves into these particular positions and all sort of things because of how they're able to lobby the government. So maybe you are even able to give them marginal things like maybe roads, or maybe they don't even have the cars, maybe they don't even care about these things. But the last thing that they say is that, they're going to be able to be long-term investment. But the problem is that it's flawed. Only government are able to engage within investment. In our side, government and people are able to engage within investment because people are now equipped with the capital to be able to go into business. It means our side is much more better because 2 parties are involved into creating more utility in the economy as opposed to their side that monopolizes it for the government. But the contention here is from opening the government is that, people are going to have these particular skills, but they also want to co-opt our benefits by saying that, people can always look for jobs and all those sort of things. That doesn't make sense because being a construction worker drains your energy and your blood. You're most likely not going to be able to explore other alternatives. The optimization of choice for my partner is that you have money, which means that you can decide anything you want to do. If you want to get other jobs, maybe you can. If you want to get a skill, maybe you can. If you want to be educated, maybe you can. You really don't have that particular choice to say that you want to co-opt benefits. Simple debating, you don't just co-opt anything. The next thing to say in my speech then is the contention from our side. The first, on the clash of narrative. The narrative on their side is that poor people can only make it through hard work and menial jobs. Three arms. One, you de-incentivize them from upskilling because they get contented in that little that they see. But two, is that you push for more things like gentrification and those arms that happens between like black areas, black community areas, and all those sort of things. But three is that it affects the economy because my partner already mechanized how we are currently moving more into AI and technological like advancement. The idea can't be, oh, you're going to be doing menial jobs and you're going to be learning AI. It doesn't work that way. Most times people have to prioritize. On our side, the priority is on upskilling towards things like AI because you have that luxury of time because you're able to use your money to do a lot of things. But on their side, you have the crippling of economy because there is a problem solution mismatch in the labor market and the skill that people have because these are the reasons why like these particular countries like stay to be poor and all sort of things. The counter narrative on our side is that your future is in your hands. Your government trusts you with money, which means that we're able to hold people more into accountability, which collapses the argument that people are going to misuse these resources because you know that these particular things are in your hand. These are the narratives that we form on our side of the world. We win on the narrative. But the next thing to say is that, oh, why will poor people use this particular thing well? There are three things on why they will use it well. One, they know that this is the only shot that they have, and government is going to escape future accountability. They know the government is not going to listen to them in the next few years. So they have the responsibility and all the incentive to use this thing well. But two is that when countries do things like cash sharing, they heavily educate people on how to spend. This is simple common sense. We've always seen government do these things. The incentive is because they always want to sustain the economy and sustain the wealth. This is how it always works. But the theory is that they've spent their life strategizing for this particular moment. They fantasize on what they are going to invest in when they have the money. It doesn't make sense for you to say that they finally have the money, they go and gamble it. The next thing in my speech is that why is this even good, regardless of how they use it? Because I think this is sales extension. There are two things here. One, most times they've spent all their lives doing things like low skilled work. So it means that even in the best case scenario, because I am assuming opening the government is able to do everything, like all my partner's argument doesn't work. So let's say in a magical world, government is perfect. Like this particular thing doesn't get stopped. The problem at the end of the day is that they already do menial jobs most times. They already like DoorDash and all those sort of things. You really don't create any unique like difference in that particular world. It's not different from status quo. Our world is different from status quo because we are able to give people the choice to be able to go into any skill and not boxing them. So regardless of if they use this thing well or not, the existence of that choice is good. But the next thing is this: most people are poor because of governmental failure. So regardless of their reaction towards it or not, government owes them this responsibility to be able to take them up, but in a way that they don't lose their dignity. What's your PI before the extensions?
All right, land is always appreciating. Real estate is growing. So when you say that these skills won't be used, that's a blatant lie.
No. If you're an average intelligent voter, like the judges are, you're going to know that we are moving more into technology. We now have machines that can literally build in blocks and all those sort of things. So maybe there are people that still does this menial job, but it's going to reduce. So it means that the competitiveness is going to like be scrolled against them. So maybe they do get these jobs, but it's at a very, very low pay, but it's not compared. You can't compare a menial worker to someone that is into AI and making millions. Basic common sense. There are three more extensions left there. Number one, the exclusionary. Not everyone has enough strength. Some people are disabled. Some women don't have enough strength as compared to men. But they say, put them into offices. That is the same route that patriarchy always used to marginalize women, because they tell them, oh, you are working less, but we are gaining more. It means that they worsen and even give patriarchy the opportunity to backlash against you more, because these guys say, oh, you are doing less work than us, and all those sort of things. You are into like the better aspects and all those sort of things. You just give patriarchy the tool and you keep on recycling oppression. But the second thing here is dignity. More mental harm exists on these people because statistically people get more strain from things like menial jobs and all those sort of things. So it means you have more people with depressions and all those sort of things. In our world, you know that you are able to be much more flexible, which means your mental harm is most likely your mental health is most likely going to be better. Mental harm is a very, very big issue because it's 2026 common. A lot of people are going crazy and all sort of things. But the last thing in extensions is on SMEs. What happens in your world is that you eliminate small companies that focus on things like infrastructures and sectors and all those sort of things. The government now makes them out of the market because they cannot compete with servitors, and they cannot compete with like how government is going to pay things like menial workers and all those sort of things. So we are saying that these guys are going to be so catered for. Most times, small companies can't do that, which means there is an inherent harm that you do to the economy, and you almost likely make everything to be worse for individuals proud to oppose.
Thanks for that speech. Can we have our member of government?
Chairman Odibo.
Yes.
Just a moment as I set up my timer, and I'll be able to turn in my camera and start my speech. Okay, so hopefully I am audible and visible as well.
Yep, yeah.
Okay, sure. You can just refer to me as closing government, no need for gender pronouns. Really, in case you have a POI, please don't scream. I have a very bad hangover, but I'll be able to take you diligently. Okay. I'll start on my next word. Chair, from closing government, we say poverty is not just about the lack of money. It in itself is about the lack of purpose, the lack of skills, and a place in an economy. We say then the debate is about governments and how they choose to help the poorest people. Are you choosing to help people to survive today or on a long term? This opening statement introduces the biggest clash in this debate, which is on the idea of longevity that both teams try to argue for within the round. My issue with opening opposition is that if you say choice is an important stance, you need to also mechanize why it is true that these individuals have a lot of choice, considering that they are poor people. If the choice to do certain jobs existed, I don't think they would exist within the situations that they are in that mandate government intervention. That means we must recognize a problem and try to solve the problem. It's unclear what opening opposition's problem is within this particular debate within that regard. We want to deviate from opening government. Opening government assumes because you're poor, you're most likely going to be irrational, you're going to misuse the money and stuff like that. We don't think that's the premise that we want to take in this debate. We want to agree with the best case scenario from opening opposition that when you, and their response to OJ is also just very flimsy, because I don't think the response to irrationality is the idea that people have sense. No, the response is simple. You are a rational actor because you are suffering, you are proximate to your challenges, meaning the nature of responses that are going to exist is because of the proximity to challenges. When you have money, if your child is sick, your sacrificial self and your instinct is to help that child heal. That means if you get the handout, you're most likely going to want to direct it towards that direction, which drives the premise of the argument on opening opposition about responding to necessity of these individuals. We're just going to explain why such things can easily deplete, which means it becomes a continuous cycle of a burden on government. And it's worse if it's within like developing nations where you're constantly borrowing to maintain these funds. We think it's extremely bad in itself. But it's also to assume that some of these projects and programs have not existed. They have, because notice in like developing countries like Uganda, where governments have effectively built projects with World Bank to create access to employment since 2017 over up until 2026. That means if you're weighing up the argument on evolution of AI, evolution of like tech and why it consumes people's jobs, you must also try to evaluate how long it takes to sustain itself in the market, but also to become the primary go-to for individuals within these labor markets, to deconstruct the need for individuals to work within these spaces. I don't think you get that nuanced analysis from the case that comes within opening opposition within this debate. But enough of the negative matter. Let's have a few positive responses and see how they respond to the case that comes from opening opposition, but also to establish a net positive. The first argument on extension is the idea on gender and intra-house dynamics. And the claim here is simple. We think empowering marginalized households in itself becomes much more reliable than cash transfers, but it also resolves the gender disparity that opening opposition wants to push for. Why is this necessarily true? 3 structural reasons. The first, wages are paid directly to these individuals that work. The second is that cash transfers are often controlled by household, like the household heads. We think this is extremely bad in itself. But the third thing is that work increases the bargaining power that individuals have within society. And we think this works to the very advantage of like deconstructing gender roles in themselves. But why is this much more likely to occur? The first thing, notice how in society, patriarchal norms often shape the nature of decisions that exist, but also who gets to attain power within a family hold. We think, secondly, what happens is that income in itself is much more likely linked to the labor that these individuals contribute to, and that is what defines autonomy. So if you want to create accountability or like to create the existence of a crackdown on gender roles and how women get to shape their own spaces, we think it happens better on our side of the house. Why is it necessarily true? We think, one, when you earn direct income, you're most likely going to have independent decision making within that regard. We think then public work within itself legitimizes the deconstruction of gender roles, because I don't have to be at home as a woman if I have employment. Notice, we already posed it to you in the opening speech in terms of why most likely these alternatives to create the amount of choice and agency that opening opposition wants to have in this debate is less existent. They ought to have framed the principle of choice by explaining why those other alternatives exist. The biggest response you have from opening government is to say, if you agree that those options exist for these poor people, I don't understand why a government intervention should limit your capacity to actualize that choice. We agree with that response. However, on a mitigatory mechanism from CG, we want to assert and say, those choices don't necessarily exist. The alternatives you claim on your side of the house don't necessarily exist. The second posit is on the idea of elitism. Before I go to mechanize this, your POIOO.
So the idea is you don't know, not everyone needs that job. Some people just need to migrate to other places. Some people just need to treat their terminal illnesses. Some people just need to get
15
other better
seconds.
skills. Why
15
you box them?
seconds. So it's simple. The response is pretty simple. You assume in a blanket that giving you this money all of a sudden makes healthcare accessible, makes education accessible. No, government is giving you money, but is not subsidizing the costs of these things. That means in a long-termist scale, you're most likely going to be unable to, as an individual, cater for those things. If it's a terminal illness, it's probably going to take a span of like 5 years. You're suffering from cancer and all those things. It's unclear why a one-time handout all of a sudden resolves these particular challenges on your side of the house. Lastly, on elitism, it's unclear why, if you agree to the fact that poverty in itself is also something that is entrenched by power, you want to give people handouts, especially probably within like developing nations. Why is this extremely bad? We think the system of elitism relies on creation of structure that can be manipulated, banking systems, and how these poor people are able to access cash. Meaning, if LO wants to frame that corruption is less likely to exist on their side of the house, they largely need to explain why it is why it is true that corruption won't exist, because we think standardization of these particular systems with no metric on like direct control means that like huge bureaucratic systems means a lot more people are going to lose out within that regard. Opening opposition is never able to win this debate by just asserting the fact that you can crack down on the power imbalance that exists for poor people. You then assume that these poor people have a lot to do. But notice, these extensions address a few things. The first one, urgency, solvency, and just longevity that opening government wants to push for in this debate. We say then, on closing government in my last 15 seconds, poverty is not just an income problem, it is largely a power structure problem that you need to solve on a long-term basis. Here.
Thanks for that speech. And we have the member of the opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to start my, give me a second. Great. I'm going to start my speech. in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, the condition of poverty, that is to say the structural inability to accumulate wealth and achieve social mobility, will never be measured by the wages people earn for a few months in a public work program. It ought to be measured instead by long-term stability and capacity. That is to say, in a world where temporary labor programs exist, most recipients return to the same cycle of scarcity, unable to save or invest, unable to grow resources for the next year or the next generation. In a world which cash transfers are implemented, people can plan, invest, and create small businesses that endure beyond a single month of work. We build a tradition like most of these microfinances that are able to compound the wealth of most of these people. We're incredibly proud to do so. Case in point, countries like Kenya, countries like India, countries like Ghana, they've seen most of these things working. So during COVID, state handed money to Ghanaians, and you saw a lot of Ghanaians investing most of these things into microfinances to compound the interest. But most importantly, we saw a lot of SMEs sprouting up to make sure that most of these people are able to sustain themselves post-COVID. We think none of these people in this debate have seen most of these things work practically. And that's why most of them are giving you like conversations that are not really what poor people use their money for outrightly. I'm going to contribute three main pieces within this debate. And what we are going to contribute, and the main piece of our extension, is the most intrinsic feature of economic empowerment. That is to say, financial security. Why? Because financial security itself is the precondition for every other benefit and every other investment that poor people can make. Without security, all their opportunity is illusionary. But first of all, I'm going to weigh in, and that is going to be my first substantive contribution. I'm going to weigh in on the disagreement between like opening opposition and opening government, which conveniently for us characterizes as one between temporary income and durable wealth. Notice that we on opposition say that you do not need to trade off immediate wages for long-term stability because long-term stability creates real utility. Why is this the case? Three structural reasons, and I'm starting my extension. Number one, notice that saving and compounding is fundamentally unavailable to most poor people under temporary labor programs. That is to say, even if you receive a salary for a construction project, transportation costs consume part of it. Food, rent, school fees, and other daily expenses consume all those things, which means that you just have a small money in order for you to save, which means that the extent of interest and all those things that you get on your side comparatively is lesser. On our side, you are just getting the money. You don't have to go to work. You don't have to pay exorbitant transportation and bills. In most of these instances, you have massive traffic. So most times you have to pay things like Uber or even public transport, exorbitant fees that exist on that side of the house. On our side, you don't spend all these things, which means that you have a huge sum of money in order for you to invest. That means that that investment is most likely going to yield greater dividends, which gives you the capacity to have social mobility on our side of the house. Why do we think this is important? Because this debate cannot be that, oh, people are dying, they are not getting food. And so like that cannot be the tipping point. Because if people are dying, then opening government and closing government that do not make sense to say, well, let the people that are dying go and work and then you give them salaries later. It means that inherently people have a certain form of capacity to sustain themselves currently. That is not the conversation. The conversation is that you are giving people a leeway to resolve themselves and create social mobility. How should they create that social mobility? Should you give them the money to invest and compound, or should they go and work and get that salary? We prove to you that during the process of working, and this is a process argumentation, they lose a lot of the capital that they could have invest in order to give them the comparative advantage to now compound their money in order for them to get social mobility on that side of the house. So on the side of the house, that proves that which side is able to get better dividends on savings, because we have a bigger principal, then that means that we are able to get better dividends on savings, and most times we are able to win the comparative. And that's why we win, because see, if you read the info slide carefully, everyone is able to reach like the social impact. The debate is about who is able to reach it faster and on what scale. And that is why closing opposition wins the debate. We cannot have the comparison about choice and all those other things, because I think you can still have a choice to work as a mason, or if you are disabled, or if you're a woman, you can probably go and like do something, maybe sweep the roadside, sweep the construction site. These are things that women can do. These are things that disabled people can do. We don't think the conversation is really about choice. It's about people need mobility, because what differentiates poor people from rich people is that most rich people have been able to put their money in things like investment, assets, and most of those things have compounded enormous wealth, which they pass on from generations to generations, which means that if you don't break this asymmetry and give people capacity in a way that can compound to take them and give them social mobility, what you create is constant vicious cycle of poverty. So if the temporary job, like if their salary is meager and the temporary job fails, they don't have anything. The money, the principal they also saved is so small and cannot give them that social mobility. It's on our side where we get that massive social mobility. Shoot your POI.
Speaker, it's
CG.
very much unlikely that government is giving people saving money to then just compound in a bank when most people
That's
are
the
in debt.
thing. That's the thing. If you were a Ghanaian, you literally would have understood this argumentation. State was literally sharing things like 5,000 Ghana cedis. Even me as a pharmacist, I have to work for like 3 months in order to get that 5,000 Ghana cedis that state was given to people. If you put that money in a treasury bill for 2 to 3 months, the money you are going to get, I as a pharmacist, if I work for one year, I'm not going to get that money. We don't think state just gives people peanuts in order for them to survive, because I already tell you that the comparison in this debate is not that people are dying and you need to give them food and all those other stuff. Then that means your mechanism will not happen. Your biggest case from CG is that you push the burden on us to show that the impact of whatever is going to be done is not going to depreciate. And that's what we do from closing opposition. We prove to you that comparatively on our side, it's on our side where the money is able to appreciate in a way that gives people the capacity to overcome the social mobility. But most importantly, that capacity is able to better the choice mechanism that open opposition says. Because for you to have choice, you need to have the capacity in order to make the choice in the first place. We are the side that gives people the capacity to maximize their choice in ways that they are not constrained when these things becomes like a compound in certain different ways through things like investing in SMEs and all those stuff. But most importantly, they now have direct control over their lives as compared to going to work in temporary jobs and all the other things that they claim on their side of the house. We think that is best utility, because at best they have epistemic access to themselves and they're able to match their true preferences because they now have the capacity. See, closing opposition wins this debate strategically because we prove that we give people capacity in order for them to get social mobility. That is the only way you are able to solve poverty for these people, and that's why we win. Incredibly proud.
Thanks for that speech. Can we have the government whip speaker?
Okay, hopefully I'm audible and visible. Let me just get my timer. I will start on my next slide. Okay. Chair, don't be gaslit. You don't need to be Ghanaian to understand that when you're given money as a poor person, you're going to spend it on the most essential things. Israel lies to you. And I think he needs to explain why, when all teams in this debate agree to the fact that as a poor person, you're going to spend on necessity, all of a sudden, your necessity turns to investment. Your necessity turns to prioritizing treasury bonds. Why is it true that as a poor person that is entrenched with problems, you have a long-termist mindset that informs your capacity to invest further when you have immediate problems that ought to be solved? The comparative that exists on GovBench is even when these like employment opportunities are short-term or anything of that sort, you're continuously earning money through, let's say, a wedge of like a 5-month gap, certain contracts that last up to like 12 months, or that is a year. It means that you have a certain capacity that you develop off of yourself to be able to invest, to be able to save, which is more likely. It's unclear on their side, and I understand it's a TBT motion, it's a THBT motion, but you still ought to a certain extent explain how are these individuals not necessarily going to be receiving the money, but is it a one-time handout? Is it something that governments are going to continuously do? And what strain is it that exists on government to continuously do these particular handouts that ensure that individuals now have the capacity to invest within that regard? I think OG is much more proximate, and they respond ably to like the case that comes from closing opposition. Because what Zephyr analyzes is to say that that continuous employment of people in itself expands capacity, because you're most likely not just getting money, but there is also infrastructure development that aids the nature of skills within themselves that you're being able to achieve. From closing government, we want to say, one, it is untrue that because you have money, you now have capacity to exist within that society, and you're most likely you're not going to ban it out. Because closing opposition seems to say, oh, you have so many things to spend on when you're earning Uber fees and the like. It is true. However, comparatively, you still have exorbitant healthcare fees to like engage in as well. Education for your children, if you probably have kids, it's unclear why government is subsidizing those things. Paying rent, why is it true that you're not going to spend on those things and that amount of money is going to be depleted? My issue with closing opposition is we try to be so charitable to engage the best case scenario that exists on their side of the house. They have no net positive in the regard that if our side of the world is able to work, why is it still a limitation towards elevating poverty and solving the crisis for poor people? He says, no, from opening opposition, the debate can't just be about choice, but asserts the value of his entire case to the idea that individuals have control and autonomy. These things are dependent on choice. They therefore must weigh up why that control and autonomy in itself is so supersedingly different from the arguments that come within opening opposition to explain why it is necessary that individuals can frame what it is that they want to use their funding for. But I just want to address the idea on mobility, because mobility is something that is framed under one complete argument, which is just the macroeconomics of the policy that is being taken by government. And it's simple. The claim we say on our side of the house, public work programs within themselves stabilize local economies and reduce the inflationary pressure that could most likely exist within the societies. Why is this necessarily true? Three structural reasons. A, we think money that is given to people without increased productive output in itself creates a higher risk for growth of demand minus the existence of supply, which means you leave these poor economies susceptible to the idea of inflation. Inflation becomes bad because it affects people disproportionately. If you are poor, you're most likely going to suffer more from inflation as opposed to someone that already has the capacity. But the second thing, we think increasing supply in itself while injecting money becomes much more important. And this is achieved on the comparative, because in this instance, individuals have employment. Individuals are constantly gaining skills. That means if there is supply that exists within society, they have the capacity to engage to afford the basics within this particular society and go the extra mile of investment. But we think then the last thing is just to explain the idea on like the impact of inflation in itself, because I think this counteracts with the argument from closing opposition. Because if closing opposition assumes to say you're most likely going to spend the money you're getting out of the wages on like basic things, transport and the like, we think it's still the comparative that is most likely going to exist. Because if there is like a high rate of inflation, education services are expensive, food is expensive and inaccessible to individuals, you're still going to have to spend on these things, which means what you do in the long run is to erode the capacity for welfare programs to have any meaningful impact on individuals within state. But also, the arguments that come from both opposition benches somehow assume that all other innate government policies that are meant to shield and protect poor people and individuals, social welfare programs like public hospitals, all of a sudden cease to exist on our side of the house, to say that, oh, these things are going to become so out of reach for individuals to a point where they cannot necessarily either A, access them, or B, survive within these particular economies. We think on our side of the house, we are able to address that better. We think the comparative maximizes advantage for individuals. Before my protected time, POIOO.
The mechanization of investment from my side is that more people are involved. So it means there is a loss of monopoly from government because poor people can now access investment. This beats CEO, but you can't also claim that this money can't be used for anything. What is it?
Okay, I don't see how different your argument on investment is from what closing opposition says, but I also don't understand, because what you're saying is a claim. I don't understand the mechanization that now translates into capacity for people to actually invest, because you're getting a handout. The handout is responding to necessity, like we concede to. where does it now change on your side of the house to give individuals the capacity to actually invest? But I think the last thing on our way up that comes from like OGCG, the reason as to why we are able to beat our opening is pretty simple. A, we don't just focus on worst case scenario, we are able to assume the best case scenario. 3, in terms of responsive matter, we think we engage with why the gender disparity gap is broken down. We think thirdly, we engage with the idea on investment and why it's more probable to happen on our side of the house. It goes beyond having skills that create employability. It goes as far as having sustainability for income and capital that enable individuals to invest. We think fourthly, in terms of deviating from the frame on like the poor people in themselves being what was the word, irrational. We think we are able to explain why you still have the capacity to make rational choices, rational decisions. Their analysis is largely contingent on the fact that you're able to explain what shifts from you being irrational to all of a sudden now having the capacity to utilize your salary for something that is much more needed for you as a poor person to evolve within that regard. Never been more proud to propose. Yeah.
Thanks for that speech. Can we now have the Chief Whip?
Okay, am I audible?
Yes.
Can you hear me? That's fine. If you can hear me, that's okay. I'm trying to just get into a chat. Just give me a minute.
Sure.
Can you give me 1 minute? All right, cool. I think everything is okay now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, if I'm audible, that's fine. POI is in the text space, don't badger. Yeah, check one from OG, please don't badger. I literally said that twice. I'll take a POI. Cool. Let's start with the speech then. Well, let's see where the response is. Okay, cool. I'm going to start in the next 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1, go. Both government benches can't win this debate. Firstly, their cases are very not exclusive to their ward, but secondly, they are largely uncomparative. And I'm going to start with opening government here, going down to closing government. The first thing that we get from James is that in our ward, these poor people are more likely going to make irrational choices based specifically on spending. I want you to understand the logic here. James says the people that he wants to save in their ward will make poor choices in our ward. It means that if these individuals are more likely going to make those irrational choices, they are still going to make those irrational choices based specifically on those salaries. There is no mechanism or incentive to show us how they are more likely going to change their behavior in the best case scenario. The second thing is that irrational is very symmetric based specifically on how people spend money. If you say that the people that you are saving in your ward are different from the people that we are saving in our ward, we literally don't have a debate. There was a lack of logical consensus within this debate. But thirdly, there's a substantive contribution that comes from Johnson that takes the government case on its best possible ground. So let's give them everything they want. Let's assume that temporary work programs are well designed, paid fairly, and accessible to all poor people. Why do we still win? Because the intrinsic nature of a temporary wage is instability. Even under perfect implication wages and when poor end, that is problematic for 3 distinct reasons. Number 1, it undermines rational decision making. People must spend immediately to survive. Secondly, they cannot plan for the future, invest in education, or create productive assets. Utility is short-term and fleeting, with cash transfers. Recipients have predictable income and can make investments that create long-term wealth, stability, not wage size, maximize utility. But secondly, temporary labor programs reproduce scarcity. Scarcity reduces conditional bandwidth. Poor people cannot think beyond immediate needs when income is unstable. Cash transfer, free mental resources, allowing recipients to make forward-looking rational decisions. Public work programs tie them to a cycle of survival, preventing them from acting strategically. But lastly, temporary labor fails to generate social mobility. That is to say, poor people are trapped in low-skill work with no opportunity to create compounding wealth. Cash transfers allows recipients to purchase tools, start small business, fund education, and invest in opportunities that grow over time. Public work programs only provide wages for a fixed period. They cannot create generational change. We don't think we gain this specifically from James. The second thing that we get in James' words is that conditional and unconditional means that you're more likely going to get a form of like backlash from the government. There are four responses to this. We think like number one, poverty is very subjective, based specifically on most people being very, very different. The major contribution you get from Johnson is based specifically on how you want to get a financial security with a form of economic empowerment, which means that you need to understand that these forms of cash transfers come specifically from government reasoning in terms of how those different households looks like. It looks like if there are conditions within those space of like cash transfers, it means that they've opportunity to grow. Yes, they can create it into like nurturing the forms of like skills that you want to nurture within your ward. We think you gain more and maximize this based specifically on our side. But secondly, understand that those who exist on an unconditional idea, look at this, right? Vulnerable individuals who are literally dependent on this growth literally means that the money in itself is going to be channeled towards specific things that are more likely going to ensure that they can sustain and incentivize within better opportunities for better ways to literally ensure that there's responsible ideologies in the future. We don't think you're more likely going to incentivize this, mostly coming opening governments, because our world shows you how you sustain more on creating that social mobility, be it in funding education schemes, be it funding small business such as tuck shops, etc. We think you're more likely going to gain this in our world. Lastly, we think that the form of conditional and unconditional doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to create a backlash. We think governments get governments in most marginalized communities get money to ensure that they can literally fund these specific individuals. They get it through taxes, they get it through sponsorship, they get it through like donations, they get it through charity and all these specific things. It means it ought to be channeled towards these specific capacities to ensure that you can create policies that ensure that there's social mobility within the long run. You are less likely going to get that backlash because that's the obligation and the responsibility of why that money exists in the first place. James cannot stand, opening government cannot stand here. The last thing we get from them is this entire ideas of like how agency and sovereignty must win in their world. There are two reasons why this is like largely untrue. I've already shown to you comparatively lacking because both words is seeking to solve a problem. The idea here is that like as I already shows you, the info slide literally shows us that we're more likely going to get most of the benefits. Is based specifically on which word better eliminates and creates more opportunities for individuals. We think that's the agency of the of this debate, and we think that's what both teams are arguing. They can't run away with this. We think opening government is largely out. Let's take out closing government here, and closing government is a bit funny because closing government says that gender inter-house dynamic issues like solving gender inequalities based on how the money is used and all these specific things. There are four reasons that takes out open closing government here. The first is like if the decision making is largely contingent on a patriarchal system, it's unclear why at a point in time when we are literally doing like things of like injecting like power jobs and all those specific things, it's more likely going to shift the decision making in that specific world. The decision making is just going to exist in the same. We think the comparative that they had to show us is like at a point in time, when we have cash transfers, like how exactly are we going, in their word, how exactly are we going to shift the behavior of these specific families? Because it doesn't change. We think this still exists on their side, it exists on our side. It's largely uncomparative. But secondly, let's take their word at best. We think it's contingent on the evaluation of how people take this money and the cooperation within this money. We think Johnson spends a large number of time showing you how this money is insured with most expenses that are literally consumed in their side. That means that within our word, on the comparative of decision making, it means that there's more money to ensure that you can channel it towards those specific forms of conflicts, and it's more likely going to sustain most of these individuals, be it the women, be it marginalized minorities, and all of these specific things. In their word, most of these things are more likely going to be consumed with things such as like transport expenses, things such as like food expenses, and all those specific things. On our side of the house, the amount of cash injection that you're more likely going to get is based specifically on how you can channel it towards other things such as like savings account, and most of the things such as like funding small business businesses. We think this is more likely going to exist and maximize mostly on our ward. The major reason why we differentiate from our opening, I think, is due to 4 distinct things. The first thing is like we do not really get the argument of choice because it's more likely going to be existent also in government. It's like how exactly what's the decision in making most of these things, and they talk about accountability and efficiency, right? What we contribute to you, one, is financial security and economic empowerment. But secondly, we show to you how the problem with opening government and closing government's ward is how this money is more likely going to be limited. Thirdly, we prove to you social mobility in terms of like the only solution that ought to be incentivized. But lastly, we show you how money injection is more likely going to exist in our ward and how it's mostly going to solve these problems. With this, we are proud.
Thanks for that speech, and thanks to all speakers in the debate. I will deliberate, rejoin, and then give the OA. Thanks very much. Enjoyed it. I'm sorry, but by I mean we. Sorry, Beatrice, is there a room, like a breakout room, that we can join for deliberation?
Just a minute. Let me consult. Let's organize and have it. Just a minute.
Great.